Good morning, everybody. Let's start with a bell. Good morning and welcome. My name is Peter Bolland. Welcome to the Four Agreements. This is a 90-minute webinar sponsored by San Diego Oasis. We're so thrilled that you're here with us. Welcome, and thank you to all of you for, especially you new folks to Zoom and new folks to Oasis, for navigating our registration process and the uploading process and all the different things that you guys do to get here. I know that it is, a challenge sometimes to navigate all of that. But I wanted to just say a special welcome to you new folks who have never done anything with us here at San Diego Oasis. You're part of our wonderful little not so secret club. And we're so thrilled you're here. When we're done this morning, click on over to the Oasis catalog and just start looking through the many, many rich course offerings and look for that to continue to expand as we come out slowly of this stay-at-home order process. So I'm just so excited because we're here to think about the Four Agreements, and it's an opportunity for us to look through a window into an ancient wisdom tradition that has remained largely hidden from us for several reasons. One, the Toltec, as we'll go into further later, have no written language, so it's all oral tradition. And understandably, after the conquest, and in the face of the wholesale destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures and literature and religion and teaching and civilization at the hands of the conquerors, it's understandable that this stuff is going to go underground. So with this little book, The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz, we have an opportunity to look over the shoulder of an apprentice in this tradition and learn what rich insights it has to offer. By trade, for those of you that don't know me, I'm a professor of philosophy and humanities at a local community college called Southwestern College. And I generally teach comparative religion and world mythology and stuff like that. And so wisdom traditions are kind of my thing, professionally and personally. And I'm not, of course, a Toltec shaman. I'm not here today to speak on behalf of indigenous American wisdom traditions. I'm a student, like many of you, of these ideas. And I'm just struck when I study them and how well they align with other traditions that many of you might be more familiar with, like Buddhism, like Stoicism, and so on. So I'm going to share some screens with you this morning. I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint presentation, and that's going to help us navigate through some of these ideas together. So you have a lot of, just let me check in with you on some Zoom functions. You have a lot of power on your end as to what you do with these images. You can make the PowerPoint be the main screen. You can make my face be the main screen. You can go 50-50. All of that is pretty malleable on your side. So I'm going to run it kind of the way I see it right now, which is the PowerPoint is the main screen. And then my little face, my talking head, is up there on my end in the upper right-hand corner. That's a suggestion how you might do it, because I built these slides with a little space in the upper right-hand corner for my talking head to appear in. But one last word about the structure of our webinar before we dive in. We're here for 90 minutes, and I'm going to go for about an hour on this presentation, and then around 11 o'clock, I want us to shift into a Q&A process. Now, with 170 people on this webinar, we're not going to open up everybody's mics, and that would be, I think some of you know who've been on some big Zoom meetings, that gets crazy in a hurry. So I'm afraid the size of the group dictates that we use written questions. So that's what that Q&A little tab is at the bottom. Hover your cursor down along the bottom of the screen, and you'll see a Q&A tab appear. Click on that and ask any questions you want throughout the whole presentation. And then at 11 o'clock, I'll go to that written list of questions and I'll just scroll through that and I'll respond to as many of them as I can. That's how we're going to do the Q&A, okay? So if you have a question, click the Q&A box, put your question in there, and around 11 o'clock, I'll open that up and I'll start going through that and doing as much as I can. Many of you have texted me over the last few weeks and told me that, this is a beloved friend of yours. You know this book well, and you are a student and a fan of it as well. So others that are here with us this morning have not read this book. And so I want to make sure that I bring as many of you together around these ideas as possible. This is not like a college course with required reading. Let me introduce the ideas to you this morning, and that will make reading the book, I hope, much richer. And for those of you who have studied this book, I'm hoping that the details that I'll provide will open the ideas up in maybe a fresh way for you and maybe ground them more deeply into your life. So we're going to talk about this book and these teachings, and of course, this author, Don Miguel Ruiz, remarkable figure. He lives not too far from here. I'm in San Diego. He's in Tijuana and lives in other places as well. And his sons are now involved in this teaching too. So he's a remarkable cat. And I got to meet him once and attend a seminar, as many of you have. I'm sure he teaches around here quite a bit. And that is always exciting to meet the author of such a phenomenal cultural experience like the Four Agreements. So who is Don Miguel Ruiz? Well, he's called Miguel Angel Ruiz Macias, and he is better known as Don Miguel Ruiz. So Don, this appellation of respect, right? Born in 1952 in rural Mexico, big family. His mother was a curandera, which is, I guess one way to translate that is healer, a curer. What they called in medieval Europe witches, these powerful women who are the keepers of the lore, who are keepers of the medicines, of the herbs, of the traditions, and of the rituals. Women have been at the center of wisdom traditions around the world and spiritual traditions around the world. This is absolutely in keeping with that norm. And his grandfather on his mother's side, his mother's father was a Nagual. And that we can translate as shaman or master. And he grew up and he left his traditional upbringing and he went to the city and he went to med school and he became a physician. He became a surgeon specifically. And then after a near-death experience in a car accident, he left medicine. And he began to return to his roots. He began to study his family's Toltec tradition with his mother. And then after a while, he apprenticed with a Toltec Nagual in the deserts of central Mexico. And this went on for years and years. So try to imagine what it was like for this young man who grew up in traditional rural Mexico to then go to the city, learn Western science, become an accomplished medical doctor and a surgeon, and then face the end of his life and a kind of mystical experience around that near-death experience. You can read about it more in the book. And then to go into the desert and to study with a shaman these amazing oral traditions, which, as I said at the beginning, have never been written down and have been passed on from teacher to student for thousands of years. That's what we get to experience this morning, is those teachings. Now, who are the Toltec? I bet you've heard of the Aztecs and the Mayans and maybe even the Olmec, but maybe not the Toltec unless you're kind of into all this Mesoamerican stuff. So the Toltec are an interesting civilization, interesting culture, kind of in the middle of all those others that I just rattled off. So let's think through this for a few minutes and just to kind of place these teachings in their proper historical context. So the Toltec were an amazing ancient people of the central highlands of Mexico. This is after Teotihuacan, the Olmec, and this is long before Tenochtitlan, the amazing city of the Aztecs that the conqueror Montezuma stumbled into. So they're kind of in the middle of all of that. Now, the earlier Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, built by the Olmec around 400 CE, a couple hundred years after Jesus. And then the later Tenochtitlan that we just mentioned, built by the Mexica, we know them as the Aztecs, right? Around 1300 to 1400, that's really the peak, right before the conquest in 1519. So we place the Toltec kind of in between those two bookends, those incredible civilizations. And then we have their home center, a place called Tula, in the present-day state of Hidalgo. This is the home of the ancient home of the Toltec, and it flourished roughly from 900 to around 1150. But of course, it existed for many centuries before that. So just a little bit after the Mayans, who are, of course, another amazing group of people in this region and in this general time. But not much is known about the Toltec. Unlike the Mayans, they did not have a written language. So again, we rely on this oral tradition. But they, of course, remain one of the four principal indigenous peoples: the Olmec, the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Toltec. So let's drill down a little bit further. Here's where they live, just if you wanted to see a quick map here, the homeland there in the central highlands of Mexico and their rather vast sphere of influence. And just because I love these ancient civilizations and these ancient people, I'm really drawn to this. I always have been since I was a little kid. I got to share some images with you. This, of course, and some of you've been here, this is Teotihuacan, the great ancient city of the Olmec, built 400 CE, about the same time as the peak of the Roman Empire. And so here you have this celestially arranged city aligned with the stars, these ancient pyramids, just remarkable. And then again, 1200 years later, not too far from there, Tenochtitlan, the city of the Aztec, or as they call themselves, the Mexica. And this is, of course, an artist rendering of that city. Today, what we would call Mexico City. That swamp's been drained, but this is how it looked. All these causeways coming into this island city, just remarkable. So these are some of the city-states, the ancient city-states, the ancient civilizations that existed around the world of the Toltec. This image, by the way, that you see on the screen, this beautiful circle with the spiral in the middle and the four cardinal quadrants or directions, and the geometric steps, and those look like insect, I forget the right word, antenna. This is a common icon that you see in association with Toltec culture. It speaks beautifully, doesn't it? It reminds me of the Chinese yin and yang. So in the absence of a clear written record, it's just really difficult to reconstruct the Toltec worldview. This is the sad story, I'm afraid, with most of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. You know, when Columbus arrived and then Cortez later, within that first century, 90% of the indigenous American people died. Mostly it's an epidemiological story, a story of disease and immune systems, kind of like what we're living through right now. But it's also a story of violent destruction and conquest and enslavement. And so much of the art and architecture and literature of indigenous peoples is forever lost. The conquistadors under Cortez knew that if you really want to destroy a civilization, you don't just kill its soldiers. You destroy its art, its architecture, its literature, if they have that. So this intentional destruction leaves us impoverished. But that's why books like The Four Agreements are so important. They're like a message in a bottle, kind of a secret message in a bottle. that survives the conquest and the destruction. Nagual to Nagual. So the Four Agreements is a written record summarizing the key principles of Ruiz's education in this Toltec lineage. That's what this is. It's not his book. It's not his ideas. He's simply reporting as a participant in this ancient lineage of masters and students. Now, one thing I do want to sort out with you before we get too far is what the heck is an agreement? That's kind of a hurdle to get over. The Four Agreements, what does that mean? Well, we're going to sit with that quite a bit, but just to get it started, to crack it open, an agreement in this context simply means a principle. It's what Kant would call a principle, right? It's what Western philosophers call principles, a starting point from which everything will emerge. So an agreement is a principle. It's a binding covenant, a contract, a moral obligation. I think of it as a cognitive structure. It's a stance from which you see the world. We might use words like it's your prejudice, it's a set of assumptions. It's a promise that you make with yourself. And in the language of the Toltec, your agreements constitute your worldview, your cognitive structure within which new experiences are sorted and out of which decisions and actions come. And that's key, and we'll see that as we go forward. So stay with that idea of agreements as we continue to work through this, because that's going to be the handle for us. We're going to first try to unpack the current agreements under which we are laboring and get rid of those and replace them with the Four Agreements. So that's what makes the Four Agreements an unusual book. It's not just another advice book. It's not just another self-help book. The Four Agreements are not just four new suggestions that you add into your life on top of all the other good ideas. It's much more seditious. It's much more radical than that. The Four Agreements is a blueprint for, if you dare, a restructuring of our cognitive stance, of our entire assumption framework from which we make decisions and actions and proceed through life. So you can go as far as you want into this stuff. You can be a casual observer, and I absolutely welcome that. This is just a place for the curious, but if you're interested in going a little further, this book certainly gives you the tools to do that. So this set of teachings, this book was published in 1997 in Spanish first, then quickly translated into English, and it kind of took off. It kind of became a bestseller because of this woman called Oprah Winfrey. Do you remember her? Yeah, of course we know who Oprah Winfrey is. I'm telling you. I tell my students this all the time. 500 years from now, in the humanities textbooks, there will be a picture of Oprah Winfrey, because as the most powerful media producer on the planet, both an influencer in print and in television, she was sort of a kingmaker and a queenmaker. When she touches a book, it goes mainstream. I think she's single-handedly responsible for the success of this book and the entire career of people like Deepak Chopra, Wayne Dyer, Dr. Phil, which, okay, everybody gets to, you don't get everything right, but, sorry, Dr. Phil, but who else am I thinking of? Guys like Adyashanti, there are just so many. I'm going down the rabbit hole here. Eckhart Tolle. We would not know who these people were it not for Oprah Winfrey. So thank you, Oprah. When you just have a first name, I guess you're pretty influential. So she had him on and had the book on back in 2001. That put it into play, and it became an international bestseller. It stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for over a decade, and it still is they're still moving a lot of books, and after this webinar, maybe they'll move a couple more. Sold over 8 million books during that period, translated into over 46 languages. I'll stop there. You get the point. This book has had an impact, And I know that as I go around teaching, whenever I offer a webinar or a lecture on the Four Agreements, I get twice the audience size as any other topic. There's a lot of interest in this stuff, and so I'm so excited to go through it again with you this morning. Before we get to what those four agreements actually are, though, it's very important that we slow down and come to some understanding about the underlying philosophy. And I'm going to grab the book here just so I can show you something real quick. The Four Agreements discussion starts on page 25. And the first 25 pages are not about the Four Agreements, they're about what I'm about to share with you. I think this is the most often overlooked part. A lot of people just read the Four Agreements or they pin them on their refrigerator and think, yeah, I'm just going to do that. That's great, but it's not really going to take in the depth and in the transformative power that it could without us understanding the whole problem which needs fixing. The Four Agreements are the last step. The Four Agreements are the prescription. First, we need to diagnose the disease. We need to understand its cause. We need to create a prognosis or a healing plan. You can't solve a problem until you understand what the problem is. And that's what I want to work on with you now. So according to Ruiz, the fundamental worldview of the Four Agreements, or to put it another way, the fundamental philosophy, the fundamental metaphysical position of the Toltec people, and I would say parenthetically of all indigenous American people, is monism or non-duality. So in philosophy, in my business, monism is simply the metaphysical position that all is one. I like the word non-duality better. It's a little clearer. Look, this is the ancient perennial wisdom claim of so many of the world's wisdom traditions. We see it in the Vedas and the Upanishads of Hinduism. We see it in Taoism. We see it in Buddhism. All is one. And we see it throughout the wisdom traditions of the Americas. The 10,000 tribes from the North Pole to the South Pole in North, Central, and South America. All of these disparate peoples, 10,000 different civilizations with different languages, spiritual traditions, art forms, philosophies, forms of government, and so on. Again, most of them not having written languages to write this down for us, but what we can glean is that so many of them share this basic fundamental worldview of oneness. So let's set that as our starting point. And then in the language of Don Miguel Ruiz, let's get specific about the Toltec. Here's some of the words they use. That there are stars in the sky called the tonal, and then there's the light between the stars called the nagual. There's that word again. And then there's what creates the space between the two, and that's called life or intent. So again, the stars are the tonal. The light from the stars is the nagual. And then the space between them is called life or intent. And that life or intent is the most important part. Without life, the tonal and the nagual could not exist. Life is the force of the absolute, the supreme, the creator who is everything. And another word for this life would be God. And since that is such a dominant idea in our world, dominated as it is by the Abrahamic religions, especially Christianity and Islam. So it's fair to use the word God here, although the Toltec have a rather pantheistic understanding of God. God is not a man in the sky. God is simply a placeholder word for this life, capital L, life, or in Star Wars, the Force, a conscious intelligence that animates all things. Everything in existence is a manifestation of this one sacred, divine, living being that we call God. God is life. And human consciousness, here's where it gets good, right? Human consciousness is merely light perceiving light. We are the universe's way of perceiving itself. You've heard lots of speakers talk like this. Albert Einstein kind of talked like this. Remember Carl Sagan in Cosmos? He put it so beautifully too, that the universe created us so that it could perceive itself. I love that. And here it is in this ancient indigenous tradition. But it is also true. Here now we get into some of the problems, because if we didn't have that last bullet point on the slide, everything would be cool, right? Oh, everything is awakened intelligence. Would live in this blissful world. Well, yeah, right. No, that's not happening, right? It is also true that we are a mirror reflecting the light, creating an image of the light. So there's the light, and then there's the image of the light, and this is where the distortion starts to happen. This is where the world of illusion starts to happen. This is where the dream, to use his vocabulary, is born. And the dream is not such a good thing. It's a group hallucination. And yet, I can't help but be struck by this as I go through this. I'm a bit of a fan of mysticism and a student of the world's mystical traditions. I know many of you share that passion with me. That's why you're here this morning. And so in this Toltec indigenous tradition, we hear something kind of familiar, don't we? That life, that in Buddhism we would call it Dharmakaya, or Buddha mind, or Buddha consciousness, mixes the tonal and the nagual in myriad ways, completing the world with infinite form. And this is true in every philosophy, every wisdom tradition. The one becomes the many. Out of the one comes the two, and out of the two come the 10,000 things. It's personified in all the creation myths, and it's taught abstractly in books like the Tao Te Ching and here. So out of the one, I think of it like white light going through a prism. It scatters into the separate colors. So the one becomes the many. And that's the sense in which, as the ancient Vedas put it, we are that. We are identical with that one. We never lose our identity. There aren't two things. Remember, we're talking about non-duality. All of this separateness is an illusion. All of this duality is an illusion in this tradition. And so the depth realization of all the mystic traditions, the depth teaching, is to come out of our ignorance, to awaken from the dream of separation, and to realize our oneness. So we are dreaming, Don Miguel Ruiz writes. We don't see ourselves as we truly are. You know, the Hindus call it Maya, right? There's an illusory fog kind of in the way here that's sort of blocking us. We're caught in a fog, we're caught in smoke, and the illusion of separateness is keeping us from realizing that oneness. And our interpretations of the real trap us in a world of suffering. And that's what we're going to unpack this morning. For those of you with some experience in Western philosophy, maybe you're thinking back on your intro to philosophy back in college or something, you may have recalled Plato's allegory of the cave. It's in his book called The Republic. It's chapter 7. And the teacher in that story, Socrates, tells this story called the allegory of the cave. And very, very briefly, Plato likens the human condition to some people chained in a cave, and they've been chained there since birth, and they're staring at the back wall of the cave. And on the back wall of the cave, projected are shadows, projected from a fire and some other guys behind them holding cutouts of a tree or a bird or a person. And those shadows pass by on the wall. And these poor guys chained to the cave, they've been there since birth. They think the shadows are real. And so the allegory of the cave tells the story of how one of those prisoners is freed, and he sees the cutouts and the fire, and then he even gets dragged outside the cave and sees the real objects up above. So it's Plato's parable or allegory of how the human condition is a kind of an illusory dream, a kind of a mass hallucination. You know, Paul says in the New Testament, in one of his letters, he says, we see as through a glass darkly. We see as through a glass darkly. We don't have all the information. These perceptual tools are great, but they're just taking pictures. We can't get at things in themselves. So to go on with Ruiz's teachings, we are in a dream. We live continually in a dream, and it's a two-tiered dream. It's a two-layer cake. I am having my individual dream, which is different than yours, because you had your parents, I had mine. I had my childhood experiences, you had yours. We each grew up with our own set of specific conditions and experiences. And so each of us has our own kind of private dream, but there is also very definitely a collective or communal dream as well. Some of you are thinking about Buddhism right now because the word Bud in Sanskrit means to awaken. I think of all the world's wisdom traditions, the teachings of the Four Agreements have the most parallelism or alignment with the teachings of Buddhism, which is also all about awakening from the dream. So what does Ruiz mean by the dream of the world? This includes all of the indoctrination and acculturation and programming that we've all been lulled into. And I don't think of it as some sinister process. It's just naturally what happens when you come from the one and you are like the ocean scatters itself into raindrops. I'm here and you're there, and we're two different people and we had different experiences. We've developed different ways of understanding and of being in the world. So we've been, quote unquote, programmed to a very large extent. And, society is a dream. Race is a dream. Nationalism is a dream. There's a particularly dangerous one, isn't it? Tribalism is a dream. All categorization, anything that divides us up into groups is part of what Ruiz calls the dream of fragmentation. Because guess what inevitably happens? And you're ahead of me, aren't you? Once you break people into groups, hierarchy is unstoppable. One group will always call itself the inside special group. And then conflicts begin to happen, and as you know, it can become a nightmare. So the only way to awaken from the dream is to hone, sharpen, and practice the art of attention. So the word attention is key here, and I think this was a prime practice point for Ruiz's own apprenticeship under the Nagual or under the shaman that trained him. This is going to take some doing to shift our attention away from what we're habitually paying attention to and shift it to some new things. But what you pay attention to expands. You give your energy to it. The great minister Michael Bernard Beckwith puts it this way, that he says, what you appreciate appreciates. What you give your energy to gets stronger. What you paying attention to something is giving it energy. And so that's the sense in which this is a key piece of this teaching. Attention is how the indoctrination got into us. And attention is how we can break free. There's a line in one of the Upanishads of ancient India that says that the mind is indeed our prison, but the mind is also our liberator. Because in a very real way, we're trapped in a thought structure here, but we can also wield the intellect and the will and other aspects of our mind. We can wield them as tools to undo the dream, undo the damage, and wake up. It all depends on what you pay attention to, as we were just saying. I didn't choose my race. You didn't choose your race. I didn't choose the language group that I was born into. I didn't choose my parents. I didn't choose my culture. I didn't choose my value system. We all just got drop kicked out here. It's like, oh, I guess I'm going to be this white guy. I'll play the hand I'm dealt, to use the tired poker metaphor. And to that extent, we are all born into a certain set of conditions, including the value system that we were raised with and inculcated with. And that came from our parents, and it came from our culture and our teachers and our ministers and 100 other places, our peer group and peer pressure. We didn't choose those conditions, but we were brought into agreement with them. We signed on eventually. That's what indoctrination means. So we are already in a set of agreements, trust me. And our agreement then is our covenant with our given worldview. And so part of the process, part of the training of the four agreements is to start here, to start with some inventory, to start trying anyway to become aware and bring to the conscious surface the myriad agreements that I have already made, that I am already in. And there are a lot of them. So there's a fun way of describing this. Ruiz calls this conditioning process domestication. The same way that you would domesticate wild animals. We have been domesticated. He writes this, he says, as children, we didn't have the opportunity to choose our beliefs, but we agreed with the information that was passed to us from the dream of the planet via other humans. I love how simply and clearly he puts that. The only way to store information is by agreement. So agreement is how those ideas get locked in and they become our worldview, our agreement. The domestication process is so strong that at some point in our lives, we no longer need external voices to reinforce the agreements we have made. We take up the task internally. We become our own domesticator. So here's the last piece I want to think about with you before we get to the four specific agreements. This is a fun one. So take in that last point. At first, we are programmed from outside, but eventually, and this is part of the process of domestication, eventually there are forces inside of us that maintain the agreements that we have been trained into. And he calls it the judge and the victim. So let's look at the judge. There are these two characters inside of us. Let's start with the judge. He says, through domestication, we develop within ourselves a judge who enforces the dream of the world. This is our self-policing, our sense of shame, and so on. The judge shames wrongdoing and rewards good behavior. And the definitions of good and bad came from outside. But also within us is the victim, he says, the recipient of the judgments. And the victim just sinks down lower and lower under the weight of all these judgments into unworthiness and self-loathing. I'm not good enough and I never will be, says the victim. And the judge agrees. This is such an important part of the work, my friends. This is a moment where deep excavation is required into your own feelings of unworthiness, of incompletion, of inferiority, of being quote unquote wrong somehow, the wrong body, you don't talk the right way, you don't look the right way, you're not the right age, you know, all that wrongness crap comes from the collective dream, which is then reinforced by your inner judge beating down your victim. One in some traditions we call the inner child. Yeah, that's so 80s, isn't it? Now we call it the victim here in Ruiz's work. That's the Toltec way of framing it. One final piece of this judge-victim dynamic. Stockholm syndrome. We start to get used to it, we like it, and we fight to keep it. We fight to stay stuck. We fight to stay asleep. We don't want to be awakened. This is hard to face, but you have to. We feel strangely safe in this coercive, abusive environment and are reluctant to give it up. There's a kind of normalcy there, like in any abusive relationship. You start to defend your abuser. So we pay again and again for one mistake or believe that we can never change. You know, we just stay in that victim space. And for Ruiz, all of our suffering, both personal and planetary, is rooted in this dysfunctional domestication process. I know this is a lot to take in. I'm hitting you with a lot. I'm not sugarcoating this or oversimplifying this. I'm giving you the whole picture as I understand it from Ruiz's book, The Four Agreements. We haven't even gotten to the first of the four agreements yet. We're about to. But I wanted to take the time to identify and understand the problem. We are already domesticated or under the influence of a set of agreements that we didn't choose, but which we defend through this inner judge-victim dynamic. And is a very Buddhist thing to say. And that is where Ruiz argues all of our suffering comes, both the suffering in my own personal life and our collective dysfunction as a species, as a human race. And maybe you've recognized this dynamic in your own life, in your own self, that we keep searching outside of ourselves for wisdom and happiness. Maybe if I just buy that new thing, or if I read that other book, or if I go to that webinar, I'll get the explanation, and then I'll be free, and then I'll be happy. But it doesn't work, Ruiz argues. We never find that wisdom and happiness because we still see the world through this grid of our limiting and limited agreements. If you don't tend to that internal structure, what he calls our agreements, first, all those brilliant teachings and ideas aren't even going to get in, and they're certainly not going to transform you. Potent stuff, isn't it? So, what we need then is a new set of agreements. And what we need is to break the spell of domestication and awaken from the dream. That's Ruiz's pitch in this book. And there's a list of things, there's a list of qualities I want to check with you before we get to our first agreement. Here's what you're going to need to do this work. Let's check off this list and see if you agree that these are some things that would help you move through this process. We're going to have a strong willpower. We're going to need discipline. This can't be something you dabble in for a moment and then skitter off into something else. When you choose this, you have to really choose it. We're going to need intuition. Logic and reasoning are essential. They're great. But you're also going to have to trust that voice within. You're going to have to develop a practice of contemplation, to become more contemplative, to leave space, to leave openness. You're going to have to succeed in this process, develop deep trust of yourself and deep trust of your inner voice, your innermost authentic voice. You're going to have to be brave. This is for sure, because it's going to take a lot of courage to break down the old agreements. There's no doubt about it. They're not going to go except kicking and screaming. You're going to have to stay optimistic, because it's a little hard, isn't it, to do this work? It's easily discouraging. And the willingness to begin again, anew, every morning, every single morning throughout the day, that's another important quality. So if we can check all these qualities, I think that's really where the process begins. So here we go. The big reveal, the 4 agreements, and many of you know what these are already, of course. To be impeccable with your word. 2, don't take anything personally. 3, don't make assumptions. And 4, always do your best. Sounds so simple, doesn't it? It's such a small thing. It's such a short list. But what if? What if each of these became not just another suggestion, as I said before, to add to your already long list of affirmations and to-dos, but new agreements to replace old agreements. Let's approach it that way and see what happens. So let's take them one at a time. Let's start with be impeccable with your word. What does that mean? Impeccable with your word. Well, I'll take his language first right out of the book. It is to speak with integrity. It is to say only what you mean. It is to avoid using the word, and we'll circle back around to what that means. It is to avoid using the word to speak against yourself or to gossip about others. And it is also to use the power of your word in the direction of truth and love. So this is not unique to Toltec wisdom. Buddhism teaches this in the Eightfold Path, right speech. Many traditions hold this idea that our language is an outward manifestation of our thoughts. And so when you language the world, when you speak, you are turning your thoughts into physical things. You know, sound is a physical thing. It's a wave that moves through the molecular atmosphere and hits our eardrums and makes our eardrum move. Sound is physical. Words are made physical when they are spoken, and so they have a profound impact on reality. To be impeccable with your word is probably the most difficult and important of the four agreements. And it's in many ways, and we'll see this later, it's in many ways the source of all the other ones as well. Now, this isn't just our literal words, but the thoughts behind them. This is where it goes deeper, right? To be impeccable with your word is not just to control the things you say out loud, because words and thoughts are one thing. So what we're really saying with be impeccable with your word is just to practice what in Buddhism we call right mindfulness, to gently monitor thought and language and steer it in the direction of truth and honesty and impeccability. This step is going to do more than any of the others to help us awaken from the dream, because normally speech is this litany, especially self-talk, is this litany of dream maintenance. And here we're going to turn it into a force for good, not dream maintenance, but awakening facilitation. Look at how words and thoughts create and destroy. Look at the destruction that Hitler wrought with his words, with his films, with his microphone at those big rallies that we've all seen footage of. He activated the worst impulses of one of the most amazing nations on earth, Germany, to carry out a horrific institutional murder. It's mind-boggling. And just think about how in your own life, you on a micro level have been wounded by words that people have said, or how you have wounded others with words that you have said. And conversely, how encouraging words have healed you and how you have healed others with words of love and encouragement. You do not need any more evidence about the power of language to create reality. And that's what we're discussing right now. So what is it to be impeccable with your word? To be impeccable with your word is to use language or our consciousness impeccably as a force for good and for truth. Let's put it this way: to fire the judge and release the victim. To fire the judge and release the victim. That's the goal here. Being impeccable with your word means not going against yourself. It means taking responsibility for your actions while not judging or blaming yourself. See, we're way beyond just controlling the words you say. We're talking about no longer harming yourself. Being truthful about your role in the problems that you see around you. That's taking responsibility. While not spiraling down and, oh, I'm a terrible person. No blame, no judgment, just clear, drama-free responsibility acknowledgement. He writes it this way. He says, being impeccable with your word is the correct use of your energy. Look how he uses this word here. Being impeccable with your word is the correct use of your energy. It means to use your energy in the direction of truth and love for yourself. If you make an agreement with yourself to be impeccable with your word, the truth will manifest through you and clean all the emotional poison that exists within you. See, that's bracing, isn't it? You don't have to fix yourself. Simply make the agreement of being impeccable with your word, and the restoration will happen on its own. Just as in the teachings of Vedanta, we are self-illuminating consciousness. Don't lose that non-duality piece. I don't have to understand the mystery. I don't have to go grab the mystery. I don't have to manifest the mystery through some conscious, laborious process. I have to just clean the instrument through which the mystery will reveal itself. I have to be the flute, to put it in Rumi's language. I have to be the flute through which God plays the music of the world. So by being impeccable with my word, I clear the space for the truth to manifest through me, as me. and around me. And of course, self-talk is one of the big problems here. Especially destructive is negative self-talk. We turn our lives, don't we, into hells by endlessly repeating negative assessments of ourselves. And do you notice this? Do you notice how we always compare our worst to their best? Like there's that stupid thing I said at that dinner party that one time that I still just like cringe with embarrassment when I recall it. And I compare that to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And I say, wow, he talks so powerfully and truthfully and authentically, and I'm just this bumbling idiot. You know, that's an inaccurate portrait of reality. It's my garbage agreement that I live under. It's my judge beating up my victim, playing this stupid game, finding the one dumb thing I said, because most of the stuff I say isn't so horrible, finding the one dumb thing I said and comparing it to like the most sublime thing ever said. Watch how your ego does that, though. Watch how your judge, let me stick with the language of Ruiz, watch how your judge does that. It goes looking like a terrible parent, like an abusive parent. It goes looking for the one wrong thing you did and just beats you down for it. Guess what? You internalize that judge. You're doing it to yourself. Remember that old movie, The Call is Coming from Inside the House? You young folks won't get that reference, but that's an old cool movie. And here are some of the bad things we keep repeating. We're too old. We're not smart enough. We don't deserve success or happiness because of the mistakes we made. These are the shameful self-talks that keep us down. We have made an agreement with the most destructive messages the world has programmed us with, and which we have taken, and then we take them up as the truth. This is not being impeccable with your word. And I have to ring the bell there. That is not being impeccable with your word. The second agreement, and I'll tell you what, the first one was the most complicated. The next three are just, I think, elaborations of the first one, so they'll go a little more quickly. The second one is don't take anything personally. Yeah, good luck with this one, right? This is such a tough practice point. Here's what Ruiz writes. Let me just grab some of his phrases here. Nothing others do is because of you. It's so hard to get that, isn't it? What others say and do is a projection of their own reality. And when you are immune to the opinions and actions of others, you won't be the victim of needless suffering. Don't take anything personally. This is a good one to memorize. Nothing others do is because of you. When someone is yelling at you because they're mad at you, this is a tough one to practice, but to compassionately say, oh, this person's really feeling stressed out right now. They're really struggling. They're not coping with some stress that they're feeling, and so it's boiling over into an angry remark to me. But I'm not going to fight back. I'm not going to turn this into a fight. I'm just going to say, okay, I'll circle back around with you later. In the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions, we call this forgiveness. To go further with the second agreement, don't take anything personally. Like I said, the next three agreements really are born from the first agreement. I do want to hold on to that. It's all part of being impeccable with your word. I like this phrase, and I think of it often. Your opinion of me is none of my business. When someone gives you some opinion of you, remember that. You might not want to say it out loud because it sounds kind of snotty, but I sometimes think it, okay. But inside I say, your opinion of me really is none of my business. It's you're projecting your dream and I have my own. This is how Ruiz writes it in this chapter. He says, nothing others do is because of you. It is because of themselves. All people live in their own dream, in their own mind. They are in a completely different world from the one that you live in or we live in. When we take something personally, we make the assumption that they know what is in our world, and we try to impose our world on their world. See what a mess comes out of this mistake. It's a challenging one. He goes on to say, even when a situation seems so personal, even if others insult you directly, it has nothing to do with you. What they say, what they do, and the opinions they give are according to the agreements they have in their own minds. Their point of view comes from all the programming they received during domestication. This is one of the wonderful adventures of having a relationship with someone, isn't it? You learn a lot about the programming they received from their domestication as you reveal to them, inadvertently, the programming you received from your domestication, and you try to make a peace between those domestications. It's fun, huh? Sometimes it works. Number 3, don't make assumptions, Ruiz says. He writes, find the courage to ask questions and express what you really want. And communicate with others as clearly as you can to avoid misunderstandings, sadness, and drama. And I think he's right when he says, with just this one agreement, you can completely transform your life. Look at how this is just really similar to the one we just did, don't take anything personally. And they come both out of that first one again. If you are really being impeccable with your word, if you are living in truth, then you wouldn't assume that somebody else's bad mood has anything to do with you. If your spouse is annoyed or grumpy or depressed, there is an opportunity for love and safety and support, but it would be a mistake to say, oh, I did something wrong, I'm to blame, and then to spiral into self-loathing. Because if you were a perfect spouse, they would be blissfully happy all the time. You're making some pretty crazy assumptions here, and it's generating additional layers of distortion and suffering. So let's dig into this one, this third agreement, a little bit further. He says, when we make assumptions, we are living inside our own dream of the world instead of living in the world as it really is. That's key, isn't it? When you make an assumption, you're just staying in your own dream instead of coming out here in the real world where we all live. And we are seeing the world through a grid of our preconceptions, biases, and projections. And then we take it personally and we use our word to create suffering for ourselves and others. See how these first 3 interrelate and impact one another. Yeah, we could do a whole hour on this. We won't because we only have a few more minutes. But think of how this one agreement would transform our friendships and our relationships. It would change everything. This is going to really improve things for you, I promise. Personally, professionally, with your neighbors, all of it. You know, when someone doesn't respond to an email or a voicemail quickly enough and we think, oh, they don't like us, or oh, did I say something wrong, or we think unpleasant things about them, and you're making a lot of assumptions. Maybe they just didn't see the email, yeah? When someone cuts you off in traffic, all of that. And back to the personal relationship one. Can you, without drama, ask your partner for what you really want? This is a fascinating question to me and a fascinating exercise. Could you come to them and say, love, I want to talk? Defensiveness comes up on both sides. Questions are often heard as accusations, but when both partners come out of making assumptions, when they come out of their dream, some really beautiful, truthful, honest connection can happen. Number 4, always do your best. He says your best is going to be different. It's going to change from moment to moment. It will be different when you're healthy as when you're sick. And I think that's kind of obvious, right? So under any circumstances, simply do your best and you will avoid self-judgment, self-abuse, and regret. As Thoreau put it, dwell as near as possible to the channel in which your life flows. So if you're having, especially during this time, we're having this webinar in late May 2020, and we're just in the height of the stay-at-home pandemic. And for many of us, this is an extremely difficult, trying, stressful time of authentic fear. And it's difficult. And some of us aren't always finding everything so easy to do. Suddenly, many of the people I know who have young children are working from home, parenting from home, and homeschooling from home. It's impossible to do all three of those things well, especially when you yourself are having sometimes, in some cases, overwhelming feelings of dread, of anxiety, of anger, of hopelessness. So to be authentic, to be impeccable with your word, is to be able to honestly say, this is as good as I can do today. And I'm going to let the inner judge be quiet about what the perfect me should be doing. Always do your best, knowing that that's going to be different. And it is this fourth agreement, I think, that allows you to put the other three into practice consistently, allowing yourself to ebb and flow. Simply make the commitment to always do your best while honestly acknowledging that that is going to look different on different days at different times of day. And by the way, this is not about making excuses. It's a stance of supreme responsibility and honesty, and it's thereby profoundly liberating. And this whole four agreements process is about coming out of a cage and into freedom and authenticity. And when you consistently do your best, the judge has nothing to talk about. You deprive your inner judge of opportunities to criticize you because you're like, hey, I honestly am doing the best I can right now. And don't expect that you'll always be able to do those first three agreements perfectly. Don't expect that you'll always be great at being impeccable with your word. That's going to take time to undo. And don't expect that you'll be able to immediately break the habit of taking everything personally. Our ego is deeply invested in nursing its own woundness. When there isn't drama going on, our egos find a way, often without our permission, to create it, to make problems, to say things, to stir up trouble so that we have fun fighting for our dream. And regarding the third agreement, don't expect your propensity for making assumptions to magically lift right away because you went to this webinar. We are deeply attached to our dysfunction. And so the fourth agreement's really great because it kind of lets us off the hook. It says, let this be a process of increasing, like a dimmer switch going slowly brighter, of increasing authenticity. Simply do your best, smile and let go, and laugh at yourself, and know that with each small effort, things are moving in the right direction. So the four agreements are a summary of the Toltec path to mastery and transformation. And by making and keeping the four agreements, you are dismantling the old mode of consciousness that trapped us in perpetual suffering. And yes, it is very much an inside job. You do this for yourself. I'm afraid it's a little bit like Theravada Buddhism. It's every woman and every man for himself. You cannot bring about this transformation for another. I know a lot of you are dying right now. You're like, I'm going to buy this book for my husband, for my wife. They need to change their assumptions and so on. I know we want to, as they say in recovery, we want to work other people's programs. We don't want to work our own program. How about we just work our own program? And guess what? That's enough. Because if you make some of these commitments and changes, that changes everything around you. As Ramana Maharshi said, the single biggest contribution you can make to world peace is to show up awake. Think of how this personal transformation would impact and transform your marriage, your business partnership, your family with your children and grandchildren. And parents, think of how it would transform your political engagement, your engagement with your neighbors. You showing up with a new set of agreements is going to ripple out as a zone of peace, authenticity, truth, and loving kindness. And other people are simply going to begin to ring at the same vibrational level. And then buy them the book for their birthday and see what happens. So when we work on our own awakening, we contribute inexorably to the awakening of the world. So our whole life is based on the agreements that we have made. That's where we started this morning. Our whole life is already ringed round with agreements that we're already in. This book is an invitation to examine those, to exhume those, and to make new agreements. New agreements, new life. So you decide, freedom or a cage. That's the question this book gives us. It's a short little book. I think part of its impact is how concise and how direct it is and how simple the language is. So that's one of the things I think that attributed to the enormous success of this reading. One last cultural reference, and then I'll turn to the Q&A part, which I'm very excited about. I see we have 5 or so questions. And again, if you have a question that you would like me to maybe address, type it in the Q&A box there. And I'm going to turn to that in a minute, and we'll start getting into that and seeing what happens, seeing what comes up. But this is the opening line from the classic collection of the wisdom of the Buddha, called the Dhammapada. And I think it perfectly encapsulates this Toltec tradition as well. And I almost get chills when I read stuff like this. The hair on my arm stands up because it never ceases to amaze me and thrill me that when you get close to these wisdom traditions, there is such an experience of recognition of universality. Listen to how this aligns with what we just got done doing. Buddha opens the Dhammapada with this. He says, our life is a product of our thoughts. Our thoughts of yesterday built our life of today, and our thoughts of today build our life of tomorrow. Our life is a product of our thoughts. That's the 4 agreements. What he's calling thoughts there is our dream, our collected assumptions, some of them programmed into us, I guess all of them programmed into us at some point, and then maintained by that sick little dynamic between the inner judge and the inner victim. So let me go to this slide, and this just puts the 4 agreements up on one slide so we can kind of look at them all. And for one last moment, and then I'm going to try to find this Q&A. What I have to do to find the Q&A, though, I see, is I need to take this slide down. So let me stop the share and come over here and get into this Q&A thing. Oh, nice. So we have 9 comments now. Go ahead and just keep on adding in there. I'm going to scroll through and let's see, do them in order here. So, okay, good. So Jan, hi Jan. Good to not see you. I can't see you, but glad to know you're here. Again, I wish we could open this up and do it like a real webinar, like a real discussion. That's problematic because we have 170 people on this thing, and that would quickly get kind of crazy if we opened up 170 mics. So I'm sorry we can't do that. But Jan, your comment, and I think it's really good, and it's something I'm thinking about a lot too, and you'll see why a little bit later as we wrap up around 11:30. But Jan's comment is, our white fragility is a result of our domestication and acceptance of our agreements. Yeah, for those of you not familiar with that term, white fragility, that's an interesting idea that comes out of our anti-racism work and our white allyship work. It's something we'll dive into much greater depth at a later webinar. I'm going to do a webinar in June called Dismantling Racism, One Insight at a Time. But just to respond to you, Jan, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the whole thing about racism, about the superiority of one person over another, it is a perfect example of domestication. And what I've been learning in these last just 3 or 4 years as my wife and I have been digging deep into a process of re-education, all the things I didn't learn about racism, about the history of institutional structural racism, and what white allyship really means. It is perfectly clear to me that racism is often unconscious or implicit, and that fits perfectly the definition of what we've been talking about today. We are dreaming, and we don't even know that we're dreaming. So we come into with all kinds of packed assumptions or prejudices, as we sometimes call them. And so there are many, many tendrils that come out of our anti-racism work that connect perfectly to this issue of agreements. So it looks like Dawn, I'm going to come to your comment next. Dawn wrote, merely a possible observation. We perhaps do choose our life, our parents, our possible life path in order to learn the lessons necessary to our soul. We are all one in the collective soul. Yeah, that's a really beautiful idea. And I've heard that idea before. It's certainly a part of some wisdom traditions that it isn't all just random, that we are placed in certain families. Either we are chosen from some celestial sphere, we choose to be born into a certain family, or maybe that's driven by forces that in Hinduism we might call karma. So that's above my pay grade how all that stuff works, but we certainly do see that idea that perhaps we are born into certain conditions because it's what we need to experience, and it's what these are lessons we need to learn. That resonates with me powerfully in some cases, but in other cases, I tend to want to push back against that because it sounds a little fatalistic to me to say that someone born, like a friend of mine who was born, and then there was in the first minutes of his life and in the womb as he was being born, he was choked from oxygen, and so he was born with cerebral palsy. And he spent his whole life unable to speak very well and unable to walk and in a wheelchair under the constant care of caregivers. I kind of want to push back against the idea that my friend Ryan needed to learn that lesson. I don't even know what the hell that means. So I always stop short of neat explanations that put everything in their little place. I love the idea, though, that there is some volition, perhaps, or some sense into which where we are born and why we are born. I think that's a nice thing to add in, a nice counterpoint to the it's all random idea. Vicky asks this question. I like this one too. What would it look like if parents raised their children with the 4 agreements? Can I get an amen? What would it look like if parents raised their children with the 4 agreements? Any information available on the children of this time? Oh, this is really rich. I'm going to flip the question. Here's how I would ask it. What would it look like if parents embodied the 4 agreements and then raised their children? I guess that would be a start, wouldn't it? There are a number of books that came after the 4 agreements written by Don Miguel Ruiz and some of his sons or one of his sons. And there are additional secondary layers of material around these teachings that may address this. I don't know, but I wouldn't doubt it that somebody somewhere has figured out a way to make these teachings age appropriate. And as we've already spotlighted and noticed, these teachings already exist in so many other traditions and so many other forms. So it wouldn't be hard to wrap some of these insights and ideas into age-appropriate teachings at any grade level. I think that's a wonderful idea for sure. I look forward to that, right? I think as much as I like to resist, it's just my opinion now, but as much as I like to resist utopian thinking, because we've seen it sputter and fail every time throughout human history. But I have to believe that the aspiration and the intention toward the improvement of education, the improvement of parenting, the improvement of our own lives, the improvement of the agreements is an essential engine of our evolution as a species. I mean, who thinks that evolution stopped now? That'd be ridiculous, right? So obviously, as Desjardins writes, human beings are continually spiritually evolving. as well as biologically evolving, perhaps into higher and higher modes of consciousness. He wonders, and I share his wonder, I share his optimism on that, Teilhard de Chardin. And so in that sense, we better be asking those questions. How can we educate children better? How can we show up more authentically as fathers, as mothers, as husbands, as wives, etc.? Because if it's not happening in the home, how is that kid going to make it happen somewhere else? So again, responsibility is an important part of that. Janet asked this question. This is a really rich question too. How does this fit with contemplation, meditation, and prayer? Oh, perfectly, doesn't it? Many of us on this webinar are practicing meditators. Many of you have meditated with me. I used to do a live full moon sangha. That's on hold right now, as is everything else. And many of you have meditated with me on the Insight Timer app, where I have 6 different recorded guided meditations, insighttimer.com, plug. And those are free. So I think about that a lot too. I think they're in beautiful alignment. I think the 4 agreements are in beautiful alignment with the practices of contemplation, meditation, and prayer. Now, I don't want to get too technical here, but those are 3 different things, aren't they? Prayer tends to be more theistic, about a deity. Contemplation tends to be thought-centered. Whereas the way I teach meditation anyway, and there's a lot of different ways to do meditation, yeah? But the way I do it is not to sort of, not with mantra and not to fixate on a positive thought and like repeat that thought. But I try to, in my own private meditation as a meditator, and when I teach meditation, I try to lead myself and I try to lead others to that place beyond all thoughts, beyond affirmations, beyond mantras, beyond any concepts at all. More like a Vipassana meditation, to be with experience itself, to be what Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita calls the inner witness. But really, what Ruiz is talking about here is also, I think, analogous to shifting into the inner witness, to look at my judge, to look at my victim, and to kind of tell them both to stop it. You know, to go into my deeper, more authentic self. How else can I awaken from the dream but to call the dream a dream? And to do that, I have to get outside the dream. And I think meditation is analogous to that. We slip down, at least the way I like to do it, we slip down beneath the waves of the thought stream. And we observe our thoughts with sort of sacred disinterest, without identifying with them. So I think there's a lot of rich interplay between contemplation, meditation, and prayer, and the 4 agreements. These are all sacred, ritualistic consciousness practices. A lot of alignment, it would seem to me. So going to the next question here, she wrote, if you were in charge of programming of Oasis, following the 4 agreements, what would your mission statement state? Oh my gosh. That's above my pay grade too. I will pass that on to Simona, our wonderful CEO and director of San Diego Oasis. She's going to have a look at that one as well. And we can have a chat about that later. But right now, I don't know, because I don't have memorized what our current mission statement is at Oasis. I just don't have that. So I don't know. But I'll tell you what, let me back up and just answer it more generally. If every organization, every institution, from the U.S. military and the Pentagon and the Senate and the House and the judiciary branch, and Uber and Verizon and Apple and all the way down to my family, were run with a little more alignment with the 4 agreements, I bet things would be better. I bet we would be more compassionate, more patient, more humane. And I'm going to leave that question on a high note, because there are a lot of organizations that are in fact trying to do this, trying to come out of bad dreams, trying to come out of the old authoritarian bad dream, to operate more collaboratively, to create more interconnectedly. So that is a really rich question. Now, how might any organization shift if they began to build into their mission statement and the way they do their day-to-day operations along the four agreements? I think that's a really cool question. Yeah, here's a good one from Janet. How do we hold this new way of being in a world or a country filled with such craziness and lack of wisdom? Well, I'll tell you what. In some ways, nothing's really changed, has it? This is us. This is who we've always been. This is how we've always been. We have really cool machines now. Look at this technology we're using right now. It's amazing, right? But there's a real sense in which there's still that same sickness. I'm always struck by how otherwise cultured, educated, humane, loving, creative, brilliant people can be pulled into horror. I think of World War II. I think of the Nazis. I'm sorry to go back to that example again. It's part of my family story. My mother and father came from Holland, and they both lived through the Nazi occupation. Many of you know this about me and have heard my stories before, but I just saw this week for the first time my grandfather's intake paperwork from Buchenwald. And Buchenwald was the most notorious concentration camp on German soil. I know we've all heard of Auschwitz and Dachau and so on. Those tended to be in Poland and other places. Buchenwald was in Germany near Weimar, and it was a concentration camp for political prisoners and communists and Romani and convicted criminals, and also Jews who were fast-tracked, of course, for institutionalized murder. My grandfather was taken there for the crime of being a school teacher. And when the Nazis conquered Holland, they took my grandfather, who was like me, kind of a spiritual guy, played guitar, had a beard, and taught school. And he had glasses, and, enemy of the state. And they took him away and they put him in Buchenwald, where he endured horror that he never spoke about. And we know what happened in Buchenwald. All the women were forced into prostitution. Guards hung or shot inmates without provocation and for no reason. The stated mission, talk about mission statement, the stated mission of the class, the stated mission of Buchenwald was extermination through labor. Their mission was to murder people by working them to death with very little food. I don't know how, but my grandfather survived years at Buchenwald. And I just saw the paperwork this week, and I was shaking with grief for hours after that. And I thought, how is it? And I've been to Germany. I love Germany. I love the German people. And my German friends ask this same question, like, what happened? What kind of madness can take over a people? And my father loved Germany. My father was also a prisoner in Germany. He traveled to Germany many times. And he said he was treated, even during his imprisonment there, he was treated well by German people. And he had no animosity toward Germany at all. My grandfather, not so much. He was never able to return because of the trauma. But I've been to Germany. I love Germany. I love it there. I love everything about Germany. And to me, it's a mirror held up to our own face as we contemplate the direction that our society is going in now. How it can happen anywhere, and it can happen to anyone, and no one is safe from bad dream. And the Four Agreements is potent political philosophy too. So I'm completely with you that boy, we need it now more than ever. But you know what? I can't fix anybody else. Let me wrap up on this question and get to a few more. I can't work Donald Trump's program. I can't send him this book. I can only do what I can do. I can't do it for anybody else. So here's the power to do the work myself so that I show up differently everywhere that I show up. And that reverberates out. And to practice not taking it personally. And to practice not making assumptions about other people. That's hard for me to do. 2 miles from my house at a grocery store last week, a guy showed up with a Nazi swastika on his face mask and went grocery shopping. You may have seen it on the news. It's hard for me not to take that personally. It's hard for me not to make assumptions. But I see moments like that as an opportunity for deep practice. And so that's what I try to do. Let me see. Let me get to this next one here. Is the key to releasing our suffering thoughts to practice mindfulness in order to recognize that we're breaking the four agreements? I think that is a good way to put it. And this person who wrote this question is bringing in the idea of mindfulness, again, that Buddhist idea. I think it's very analogous to right mindfulness, which is number 7 on the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, yeah? To gently monitor and direct my thoughts. And when I see myself falling back into the rut of making assumptions, of taking things personally, to just go, oh, there's Peter, he's doing it again. Let's not make assumptions. Let's not make things personally. This is an hour by hour, day by day practice. You don't just go to a webinar like this and go, I'm fixed. I'm teaching this stuff and I don't have it. I'm drawn to it. I think it's essential and it's transformative, but I go around making assumptions and taking things personally all the time. I promise you this about all teachers, philosophical teachers, spiritual teachers, therapists. We're all teaching what we most need to learn. Trust me. One of the agreements you need to drop is that your guru is enlightened and you're not. By the way, I'm not a guru. I'm just saying if you had a guru, kick the pedestal out from underneath them. That's a hierarchy that doesn't help us. Liz asks, what if we actually wronged someone, say inadvertently, who hasn't, and need to resolve the conflict with the other person? What does the Toltec tradition tell us about handling that? Yeah, that's a great question. What if we had actually wronged someone inadvertently and we need to resolve the conflict? Okay, I've done someone some harm. I want to repair the relationship. In the four agreements, there isn't any specific advice on that. There isn't any specific advice on what steps to take. Just this general idea of being impeccable with your word and having to feel your way through that and intellectually clearly find your way to that. This is an apprenticeship process, and unfortunately, common here to guide us through this process for decades. So we have to continue to find that ourselves. So that is one of the challenges, certainly, is to be our own shaman, and that's very tricky to do. Your question reminds me of the Jewish idea of the 3 R's, that if you want to get forgiveness, which is what really you're talking about, how do we build that bridge that we burned down because of something dumb we did or said? Well, the 3 R's in Judaism are to feel remorse, to genuinely feel the damage that you've done. To have empathy, that's easy. The second one is repair, to go to that person and say, I did X, Y, and Z, and they were very hurtful. And don't offer excuse and context and explanation, just own it, right? That's that take responsibility part. That's called repair. And to say, how can I repay you? If I stole money, I'm going to pay it back. If I borrowed something and I lost it, I'm going to buy you another one. To repair. And the third R in this Jewish tradition of forgiveness is to reform, to change, to stop doing the thing. Does that guarantee the other person's forgiveness? Of course not. You're not in charge of them. But that's one tradition's way of sort of responding to that. I'm looking at the clock and I see so many more questions. There's 24 questions on this thing now. Man, I would love to do that, but I want to respect your time and honor your time. So I do need to end the Q&A session there. Unfortunately, let me go back to the screen that I was on because I want to share with you one more thing before we go forward. And that is this last slide. I want to invite you to join. This has been really great, you guys. This is the first full-length webinar I've done on Oasis. And this is one of the biggest audiences we've had on an Oasis webinar since we all went into the stay-at-home mode. So you guys are pioneers with us. We're so grateful for all of you. And you're all registered members now. To get into this webinar, you had to become Oasis members. It's free to become an Oasis member, as you know. But now we know you and we have your email and you have easy access to the catalog. When we're done here, look through the catalog and see if there's something you'd like to engage in. And along those lines, I want to tell you about two things, and each one gets a bell. Coming up on June 16th, this same spot, Tuesday 10 to 11:30, this is going to be our spot for June. Tuesday 10 to 11:30 on June 16th, the wisdom of Kabbalah. Like I said, I love the mystic traditions of the world. So join us as we immerse ourselves in the world of Jewish mysticism and hear its bracing call to ethical living, spiritual depth, down-to-earth humanism, and unwavering commitment to seeing God in all things. We'll do a webinar on Kabbalah on June 16th. Register for that. And another bell for the next one. And that is the one I referenced today as I was speaking, Dismantling Racism, One Insight at a Time. And that's coming up on Tuesday, June 30th from 10 to 11:30. So there's the two course numbers too. That's a quick way to find the course when you go to the Oasis website. Look for course number 320 for the Kabbalah webinar and look for course number 321 for the Dismantling Racism webinar. Let me read that Dismantling Racism description. And I really believe this, our great unfinished work in the United States and the world over is finally coming to terms with racism in authentic, meaningful, and transformative ways. So in our inquiry, we will do the important work of peeling back the layers of unconscious bias, right? The dream, and laying bare the untold history of supremacy and this is such a beautiful part of it, raise our eyes to the realization, the manifestation of the promise of America, a land where all are created equal. Who among us, Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever, does not hold that ideal dear, that we live in a land built on the principle that all of us are created equal? But we're not there. And it's the old dream that's holding us back. So the work we did today, and I love that one question about this from Jan, the work we did today ties directly into our anti-racism work. So I'm looking forward to both of these webinars with you very, very much. I am so thrilled to be able to share this time with you. Let me come out of the share there so I can see all big screen again. It has been a real pleasure to be here with you. And if you are interested in this book, again, it's called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. I hope today was a good refresher for some of you, and I hope for others it was a good introduction. And whether you go out and read this book or not, you've got a good handle now. Maybe you've been taking pictures of the screens as they went by. And thank you for being such an important part of our community here at Oasis. This is what community also now means. I don't think when this pandemic is over, we're ever going to go back to the way things were. Why would we all spend thousands of dollars to fly in a plane to Cleveland to go to a $300 a night hotel to go to a conference for 4 days and attend meetings all day with a lanyard around our neck, when we could all just do this and stay home and save a ton of money and in some ways have even more immediate contact, not physically, but soulfully and intellectually. I can't see you right now because all your cameras are muted, but I can feel you. And I feel you here, and I appreciate you so much. And we're running over time because I always run over time a few minutes because I hate to say goodbye. But with one last ring of the bell, let me just say thank you all very much. Give us any emails, any feedback about what you would like us to cover, what kind of events you would like us to do. We shape our programs around your feedback. Stay in touch with us. And thank you all so much. Goodbye, and I'll see you on the other side.